When socialist forces in the Middle East threatened to overthrow a sovereign nation, the Marines were ready. When an elusive enemy stalking the dense jungles of Southeast Asia targeted a newborn democracy, the Marines were ready. When famine and tyranny filled dusty African streets with starving masses, the world asked for help, and the Marines were ready. When a war-torn land descended into chaos, when security and stability hung in the balance, the Marines were ready. And when the next threat emerges, regardless of its complexity, regardless of its form, regardless of the climb or of the place, the Marines will be ready.
Why is Attack the Network important? Because it provides staff orientation for unity of effort. Attack the Network is a different way of approaching challenges, but it is not a separate process from normal operating procedures. It should be an inherent part of what we do. Attack the Network is the tailored application of current doctrinal processes, such as the Marine Corps planning process, intelligence preparation of the battle space, targeting, or assessment. It binds the staff together and orients them on the networks that are operating against them. Some people think that Attack the Network only applies in a counter-IED fight, but it can and should be used across the range of military operations and in any operational environment. Operations in the future will be more complex. We have to work harder at figuring out the challenges we will face. The last 10 years have shown that our opponents rarely wear uniforms and seek to blend into civilian populations, an effective tactic that we're sure to see again. Some people think that this process is only applicable to high-level staffs. In actuality, it can be used at all echelons, from company level all the way up to the Marine Expeditionary Force, as well as all components of the Marine Air Ground Task Force. In other words, it's not specific to the ground combat element. Attack the Network is not the responsibility of only one person or one staff section either. The entire staff needs to be involved in working together to truly understand and effectively engage networks. It is about turning a staff into a network to use them against another network. Not much of this is new. As you're about to see, the foundational elements of this process have been part of Marine Corps operations for decades. It wasn't until we found ourselves engaged with an adversary whose primary weapon was the IED that these procedures were worked out and codified. Whether they knew it or not, Marines have been doing this for generations. We need to institutionalize this process because Attack the Network methodology should be part of every operation we are involved in.
Throughout the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. Marines operated in incredibly complex environments. By the later stages of both conflicts, every Marine participated in operations enhanced by Attack the Network. While the name may be relatively new, having been coined in 2006, the underlying approach is one Marines have utilized with great success as far back as Beirut and Vietnam. Attack the Network is not a radical change in procedures. Rather, it's the integration of existing staff processes that allow Marines to effectively engage friendly, neutral, and threat networks. Regardless of the type, future operations will occur within a complex operational environment, comprised of multiple networks which vary in nature, are interrelated, and possess specific motives that are the catalyst for their formation. By examining the 6 pillars, we can gain a better understanding of Attack the Network. Understand the mission. You must clearly grasp the unit's mission, as well as understand the commander's intent, along with the desired end state. Understand the operational environment. The environment shapes the networks that operate within it. You must identify those variables that allow the networks to exist and thrive. This is the cornerstone of Attack the Network. Understand the networks. You must develop knowledge of the characteristics and components of friendly, neutral, and threat networks. It's equally important to recognize the relationships that exist between these networks. Organize for the fight, integrating those non-organic people, processes, and technologies into our existing staffs. Engage the networks. Interaction with networks that provide balance and simultaneity of lethal and non-lethal actions through comprehensive targeting. Assess. As a part of every mission, you must assess the first, second, and third order effects of every action. Establishment of measurable criteria helps to refine the outcomes of engagements. Though the Marine Corps of generations past may have used different terminology, the foundation of their planning and the effectiveness of the methodology has remained a constant. As we move forward into an unknowable future, Marines must keep pace with ever-evolving, complex environments. Attack the Network offers the best way to meet that challenge. The 1950s brought the Cold War to the Middle East. First Egypt, then Syria fell to socialism. And as instability took hold in the region, Lebanon sought to maintain its neutrality. But the struggle between socialism and democracy, as well as religious discord, had Lebanon on the brink of civil war. In July of 1958, Soviet-backed Arab nationalists assassinated King Faisal II of Iraq. Fearing a full invasion from Syria and open revolt of Basta rebels, Lebanese President Shimon petitioned Washington for an American presence to safeguard the sovereignty of Lebanon. Within days, the Marines landed a full amphibious assault into Beirut. Operation Blue Bat had begun. The mission? Ensure no outside forces would interfere in Lebanese political affairs.
Our specific mission was to bolster the Lebanese government and to ensure that the legitimate government of Lebanon was not overthrown by either internal forces or external forces.
It was, I guess, an interesting historical landing in the middle of sunbathers
and came across the beach, crossed the highway into a grove of cedar trees where battalion headquarters set up. 2 or 3 days later, we convoyed into the city where we relieved the 1st Battalion 8th Marines at the dock area.
Once the Marines had landed on the ground at Beirut, they'd gone into and they'd spoken or held what we'd call today a key leader engagement with prominent players, to include the leader of the military and American diplomats on station there, to ensure that everybody was kind of on the same sheet of music about what was going to happen.
We were deployed from the dock area, the Fox Company, to the railroad yard just east of the Basta area, which was a Shiite stronghold. And we were told by our NCOs to be careful about inciting the folks in that area, because that was the basis of the rebel forces.
Maronite Christians had a large portion of the Beirut area. You had the Shiite and the Sunni Muslims, and then you had the Druze Muslims that were up in the mountain areas. Right from the top, we had laid out exactly what we were going in there to do and what we were not going in there to do. Specifically, we're not going in there to prop up President Shimon and keep him in office beyond the limits of his constitution.
We had heard through the grapevine that they wanted us to protect the presidential palace. He was told in no uncertain terms, no, use your own army. It's your baby, so to speak, you rock it.
If the Marine Corps would have gone and protected the presidential palace, if the Marine Corps would have gone in and into the Basta area and tried to root out insurgents and start to become actually involved in combat operations, that perception of neutrality would have been lost. Once you lose that perception of neutrality, you become another combatant, and that just drags you into a mission creep very quickly.
During Operation Blue Bat, the United States Marine Corps and the U.S. forces in general did a lot of things in organizing for the fight to make sure that they were capable of completing their mission.
The Lebanese officers, usually a lieutenant was assigned to our outfit. They would go out with a patrol to make sure that there wouldn't be any conflicts, that we wouldn't provoke any religious problem. What
that did was gave a language capability and a cultural capability to the Marines on the ground.
The purpose of embedding Marine Corps forces with Lebanese Army forces was to ensure that there was minimal confrontation with the Muslims or the insurgents at the time that were trying to overthrow the government.
We stationed Lebanese Army units between Marine units and rebel forces to ensure that there's a buffer so that we didn't cause any undue friction. if we'd had direct contact between the Marines and the rebels and it had gone into a shooting war, we could have seen the total breakdown of the Lebanese military. The officers, being mostly Maronite Christian, were stuck with the government, and the Muslim soldiers would have filtered back into the rebel groups.
After the first week or so, everyone started to be friendlier. The Lebanese officers had a great deal to do with that. Having their role in connecting with the populace was what we needed to have, because we had no other interpreters.
We'd given the Marines lots of indicators to look for, lots of specific information requests that they had to bring back when they were out there on these patrols.
One patrol I went on, they said, are there people there that don't belong? And then we were to look for roadblocks, or what appeared to have been a roadblock. Is there a car parked off in the trees now with some people just sitting around it?
I think what really made the Marine Corps successful with the Lebanese people was our fire discipline and our ability to not return fire without a visible target, which only further, in the Lebanese civilian mind, increased our value and our honor.
We were able to complete our mission without violence. And once our mission was over and they had a new government, we left.
There was many lessons learned in Operation Blue Bat that have been employed in Operations Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom. Specifically, our understanding of cultural nuances and culture and language, and the importance that plays in an operation such as what we have going on in counterinsurgencies. So the lessons learned from Operation Blue Bat in 1958 have actually carried forward to today and are actually being employed today by the Marine Corps.
By the fall of 1958, the situation in Lebanon had been stabilized, and the Marines loaded back onto the ships that had delivered them to Beirut. An understanding of the mission ensured the appropriate restraint to maintain support of the populace, while partnering with the Lebanese forces provided legitimacy to the burgeoning democracy, making Operation Blue Bat an unqualified success. During the Vietnam War, Marines found themselves embroiled in a complex environment, fighting the hybrid threat posed by the North Vietnamese Army aligned with the Viet Cong. Though these threat networks gained a propaganda win with the Tet Offensive, the cost to the enemy was the decimation of VC forces. January of 1969 brought reports of a buildup of NVA personnel, weapons caches, and supplies in the A Shau Valley, preparations that had all the markings of another spring offensive. The NVA's exploitation of the border with Laos further compounded the challenge, as Marines had to combat not just weather and terrain, but a relentless enemy as well. Marines saw an opportunity and launched Operation Dewey Canyon, devised to eliminate the enemy's ability to regenerate while simultaneously setting conditions to transition to the ARVN forces they had been training. Over the course of the 56-day operation, Marines would see some of the most intense combat of the Vietnam War. Their mission? Interdict enemy personnel and supplies being brought in via the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Dewey Canyon was designed to deny the North Vietnamese a secure supply base in the Dak Krong Valley.
Well, the mission, for the most part, was to attack into the base area 611 and destroy North Vietnamese logistics bases.
The North Vietnamese at that stage in the war were coming across the border in main force units. I'm talking regimental and division-sized units. The war was really heating up.
We were dealing with hardcore NVA battalions that would dig in fortified bunkers. They were sophisticated, they knew their tactics, and they were there to fight.
When we landed, there was barely enough room to set down a helicopter. And I expected that we would either get shot down or we'd get in there and then we'd be attacked. Fortunately, they didn't expect us to come in to set up with the amount of force that we brought in.
Marines had observed a tremendous amount of truck traffic in Laos, bringing in supplies and so on.
The limitation of the border itself was psychologically painful to everyone. We could actually lay there at night and listen to them shifting the gears on the trucks coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, knowing that you're fighting an enemy on one side and he has an entire resupply chain coming down the other. It is very demoralizing.
Colonel Barrow requested to go over and ambush him. The 9th Marines was specifically chosen by General Davis.
It was obvious that we needed to move into that area to prevent further North Vietnamese attack into South Vietnam.
You know, Dewey Canyon was in the mountains, and I think one of the peaks was something like 12,000 feet. And so it was very difficult operational areas, particularly when the weather started interfering with operations.
It's going to be 140 degrees in the rain, and you're chopping your way up very real-time mountains.
It's difficult on fire support, it's difficult on air support, it's difficult on logistics.
The topography strictly limited the tactical maneuver. It was in the monsoon season, and the logistics and the supply, I think, were as difficult, if not more, than the enemy.
Of course, there were recon teams operating in the area before we came in there, so there was pretty good situational awareness.
General Barrow's headquarters were using large numbers of reconnaissance units out there on the ground, especially in the trail networks, seeing what activity was going on. So there was a lot of human intelligence out there gathering, and there was a lot of signals intelligence going on at the time. And there was a lot of photo reconnaissance going on. So those are the 3 biggies, I think, that took place.
We got the mission to conduct a raid and ambush in Laos. It was a basically find, fix, destroy operation.
The North Vietnamese were tough son of a bitches. They were well experienced, tough infantry, and you had to go in and dig them out. If you made a mistake, the North Vietnamese would have your ass.
We waited till dark. There was no moon. We couldn't see our hand in front of our face. About 85 Marines at that time, and we crossed the border and we moved into Laos.
Everyone had to go in light. You carried 14 magazines of ammunition filled, a minimum of 6 canteens, and you had a little bit of food. Machetes, ropes, and ponchos were the key. Ponchos, because that's the only way you're going to stretcher your dead and wounded. We'd carry dead and wounded up to 3 or 4 days, couldn't medevac them.
We didn't have a lot of LZs around the area, so as far as getting casualties out and getting reinforcements in was very difficult.
One of the good things about working in that environment and the tactical considerations was a free fire zone. There was basically no indigenous population out there.
The North Vietnamese controlled the area. There were very few villages where you had to control a population where the VC could infiltrate. So we crossed the river, got across the road, and we heard movement. I reported back what appeared to be a large amount of troop concentration. So we set up a hasty ambush.
That initial ambush was very quick. We had to get in and get out. It had to be conducted in one night.
Probably about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, we heard engine start up. As we waited, a truck came into the kill zone. We let that truck go. Then the next couple came in, and they had ammo. And that's when we triggered claymores, and then all hell broke loose. We had successfully pulled off the ambush and blocked the road.
All of a sudden, the rules of the game had changed, and their supply convoys were just like grapes. The success was really noted by the number of casualties that they caused among the North Vietnamese and the amount of equipment and supplies, and that they forestalled any major offensive by the North Vietnamese.
It's terminology that's evolved over the last 10 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, Attack the Network. Is it any different today than it was back then? No, it's new words. We lost 130 troops, 920 plus wounded, but we had some great fighters that were disciplined, that had character, that were very courageous in the face of a strong enemy. And we were operating in their backyard. And that was the first time that had happened.
An understanding of the operational environment, both the physical terrain and the political climate, proved critical in the ultimate success of Operation Dewey Canyon. Marines recognized the artificial protection that the international boundary afforded the enemy and understood how essential the logistical buildup was to North Vietnamese Army operations. Dewey Canyon successfully denied the enemy the means necessary to conduct a spring offensive. In what would be the last major Marine campaign of the conflict, the decisive actions taken in the Ashal Valley established the initial conditions needed for U.S. transition out of Vietnam. In the early 1990s, the world was horrified by images of emaciated Somali refugees starving to death while brutal warlords fought for control of the drought-stricken country. International aid groups tried to intervene, but found themselves powerless to stop the rival clan leaders from looting relief supplies. As civil order disintegrated, nothing short of a humanitarian disaster was unfolding. Responding to this, the United Nations created UNISOM 1 in April 1992. But the 500 UN troops that comprised the initial relief effort quickly found themselves unable to deal with the magnitude of the situation as thousands of refugees starved to death every day. In November of 1992, President George H.W. Bush decided that the United States would take an active role in the crisis, coordinating with the UN and the international community. The Marines' mission: secure the major air and seaports, key installations and food distribution points, safeguard relief supplies, provide security for convoys, and support the NGOs delivering humanitarian relief.
Operation Restore Hope really began because of the conditions in Somalia. Widespread famine. The society was breaking up into several factions. This received a lot of publicity.
The mission was to provide a secure environment where the humanitarian relief organizations could relieve the starving of the people in Somalia.
Warlords interfering with relief flights coming in, making it very dangerous for the NGOs.
And military presence brings a lot. It's not just that we bring guns to the table.
Number one, you can deploy quickly. Number two, you can establish security quickly. Number three, you have worldwide comms. And number four, you got the best gear in the world.
The idea of creating a, quote, stable environment. What does that mean? What are the other tasks that are going to flow from that?
What are the measures of effectiveness? What is it you're really trying to accomplish? What did your mission say you were supposed to do?
All that had to be figured out literally on the fly, even as troops were getting ready to move overseas. We were going into a portion of the world most people were totally unfamiliar with. We were going into society that most Americans never would have been able to understand. And yet now we had to understand what it was that was going to motivate them.
Our preparation consisted primarily of reading a book that was written by a British Army officer after World War II who had served in Somalia.
We were so far behind the curve that we ended up going up to Los Angeles and getting Somali students to help us with the intel preparation of the battlefield. What should we expect when you go into Mogadishu?
The only way you were going to know that is if you had some kind of a, what today is called human terrain understanding.
You think about the importance of culture and religion and all those other kind of things. We were a jump street. We had no knowledge at all.
We came up with a plan for how we were going to operate in and pacify Mogadishu so that the HROs could do their job. The first phase of that was an assessment of the various areas and neighborhoods that we would be operating in.
You know, if you talk about creating the network so you knew who the players were, it's the same kind of thing that you did in Iraq or Afghanistan. You know, who was the warlord that had the power and where were his boundaries? So it was very important that everybody understood when we made decisions why they were made, so that there was no confusion about why this clan was able to do this or this clan was not able to do this. But you could not take sides.
If you tried to single out a leader as suddenly an enemy of yours, you were probably going to pay the price for that. It's a lot easier for these people who might normally be antagonistic to each other to coalesce against an occupier or an aggressor against the whole of their society.
We didn't realize we were doing I.O. as we understand it today as much as we were trying to shape the environment. It was the natural way to do business because there was no radio station. Well, let's make one. Well, there is no newspaper. Well, let's print one. Be aware that we're coming and this is what we're going to do.
Ambassador Oakley would fly out to these outlying cities or towns or whatever and land, and the ambassador would essentially tell them these are your best friends or they can be your worst enemies, make the right choice here.
What we were hearing from the HRSs was obviously going to be very important. And again, it's important to remember that each one of these humanitarian relief sectors was different. You had to be sure you had people on the ground who were able to work with what was happening and then report back to you.
You know, one of the things obviously was linking with the NGOs that were already there, because they're there before you get there and they're going to be there when you leave. So establishing the right liaison with the NGOs was important.
The primary method of evaluating our success during our UNITAF portion of the operation in Somalia was the level of violence.
The assessment was hard. It was very, very difficult. When we first got there, we were experiencing, 400, 500 deaths a day. So the obvious initial assessment is, well, let's reduce the deaths per day, and that's a good indicator that something good is going on.
Some of the other points that we were using were such things as the success of the humanitarian relief efforts. Were the supplies getting through? Were they getting to the people that they needed? And what effect was that having upon the people?
So you could watch those things progress. More markets would become open, more fruits, vegetables, produce, that kind of stuff available for sale. Those are all indicators that things are getting better.
When the Marine Corps took the streets and possessed the streets 24/7 with patrols and started setting up lights at intersections and tried to return some of the infrastructure to Mogadishu, you could see the populace coming back to life. You could see women and children walking the streets again without fear of being murdered or raped.
On the political side, you had these reconciliation talks. Eventually, all of the major factions were showing up at Addis Ababa for these talks. So you had all of these things that were building towards success, setting things up for a good transition to UNISOM. It was quite obvious that a tremendous difference was being made.
The incredible flexibility of the Marines to adjust to a new environment and the incredible restraint that the individual Marine exercised over there when, rocks are pelting off his helmet and people are shouting at him, and, he's out there patrolling amongst folks that at some points didn't particularly care to have him there.
Marines, as a part of Operation Restore Hope, relieve the immediate suffering of a dying people through the comprehensive efforts of the civil and military team that responded to the unfolding crisis. This was accomplished through a balanced application of lethal and non-lethal actions, specifically engaging key points within the network based upon a constantly evolving understanding of the operational environment. Within the first few years of Operation Iraqi Freedom, Al-Anbar province emerged as one of the most violent places in the world. As the war intensified, names like Fallujah and Ramadi became all too familiar to Americans at home. A historically turbulent region, it was no surprise that Al-Anbar should be a stronghold of the insurgency. For the Marines, the overarching strategy had always been to bring Iraqis to the table and destroy al-Qaeda. To achieve this endgame, Marine commanders wrestled with balancing lethal and non-lethal operations. Unfettered by such humane concerns, al-Qaeda plundered money and grabbed control from the local tribes, unleashing brutality against anyone who opposed them. This heavy hand soon proved intolerable to the Sunni tribal leadership, and ultimately, the tribes united in a movement that came to be known as the Anbar Awakening. Resolved to finally remove al-Qaeda's cancerous presence, the Sheikhs sought the help of the Marines they had once opposed. The Marines' mission? Create security and stability within the region.
As al-Qaeda in Iraq became more violent, more randomly violent, they started turning people off, scaring them, and using fear as a weapon. That ultimately turned the population against them.
We convinced them that we would protect them, their people. I mean, they were more worried about their people than themselves. And then I think October, November of '06 was when I started getting the cooperation of the Sheikhs.
The shift was a grassroots shift, but it required the Iraqis to come to understand that their fight was not necessarily with the U.S., that al-Qaeda in Iraq was actually probably its worst enemy.
This was the entire Marine Corps understood early that this was an insurgency, whether we could say it or not.
Over the course of the war, 100 different groups identified themselves as operating in Iraq. This was not your traditional insurgency.
We needed to take a step back, study the history of a country, and understand what type of government works.
We also pulled in people outside of organic capabilities, enablers, in the form of human terrain teams, bringing in cultural and social anthropologists to really examine the culture.
As a cultural anthropologist, I would look at a neighborhood or a village by reviewing its history.
What's important in that AO? Who's the key power players? You know, who's who in the zoo, and how do I influence them?
You start to put together a map of the environment, and that leads to link analysis. To you do census, you figure out who lives where, why they live there. The one tool that really attacks the network is the local people. They know who doesn't belong. They understand their culture.
At the time, many of the sheikhs were not living in Iraq, they were living somewhere else. So you had their surrogate. Those people don't always represent their bosses with integrity, so you have to have a kind of a sense of human nature and a good interpreter. The vast majority of our communication with the local people was through our actions. They watched what we did, and they were deciding whether they were going to help us or not based on how we behaved. Over time, our actions, I believe, transmitted goodwill, which turned into people joining the police force and joining the Army.
The first recruitment and the first group of men was over 500 locals that went to the police academy. That was huge. We do have different cultures, we do have a different language, but we're human beings. You know, they want their kids to be educated, have families of their own, no different than all of us.
One of the most important things you need to have in any sort of small wars or counterinsurgency environment is you have to have tactical patience.
As we moved in, we moved the Iraqi army in with us, a platoon of Marines and at least a platoon of Iraqi forces. That's really when the people begin to believe in their government because they see their forces fighting the bad guys.
We work together with them as partners, the same way that I would work with another U.S. unit, and there was a spirit of teamwork and camaraderie among us.
And I think the real critical piece to understanding the way we assess Attack the Network is to keep things in context at the tactical level, at the operational level, and then be able to scale things up and down.
How many meals were eaten on a daily basis amongst the local people? That was one of the things I collected from the squads. When you're eating with people, you're buying food off the streets, people are going to talk.
And it enabled us to break through a lot of the networks that were somewhat shielded, not by the people, but by fear.
What the Marines were doing was nothing new. And we've always, lived amongst people, fought with indigenous forces. That's part of small wars, counterinsurgency, and so forth.
The people are the center of gravity. Whoever can control the perception of those people are going to be able to reach their objectives quicker. The enemy is looking to influence them towards their cause is just like we're trying to influence them towards our cause.
The more effective we got, the more difficult it was for the enemy. They were reacting to us. We had the initiative, and then once you have the initiative, you're winning. So we weren't doing counter anything. The enemy was trying to counter us. They were trying to counter our message, they were trying to counter our security forces, they were trying to counter our cash sweeps, and they just couldn't do it. And the more successful we were as a team, the more the people wanted us to be there and support them.
And Al-Anbar turned the tide of the Iraq War.
The narrative was always the same, and our goal and actions and objectives with everything that we did was always the same. And that was the balancing act of, having to do highly lethal operations, highly kinetic operations, and at the same time try to work towards stability and security in a counterinsurgency.
There's people in a counterinsurgency that need killing, just not most need killing. The hard part is to find out which ones do and which ones don't. Only the local people can guide the way for that.
It's not like on Wednesdays you do hard power and on Monday you do soft power. You have to be able to blend them all together all the time. All of the combat power that we had in that battalion, which was approaching 2,000 people and on tanks and everything, had no effect. It was our ability to convince the people that what we were doing was in their best interest.
Irregular warfare, hybrid warfare, whatever you want to call it, as we move forward in the future operating environment, it's going to be the sergeant and lieutenant making decisions under extreme pressure. It's going to matter the most.
It's a remarkable feat that those Marines accomplished in combat. I was there every single day, patrolling, talking to them, reinforcing that message that there's no checklist. You have to do the right thing. You're here to defend these people, and through defending these people, you're representing the United States of America, and we're going to win this war, and we're going to win it with honor.
Al Anbar presented Marines with a complex operational environment where success required simultaneous engagement of friendly, neutral, and threat networks. Al Anbar's intricate networks presented the ideal climate for Marines to take the concepts and principles that we now know as Attack the Network and employ them to their fullest capacity. Understanding these networks, their impact on each other, and the operational environment played a pivotal role in transforming Al Anbar from lost into an inspiring example for a country in the process of remaking itself. It's only through the application of all 6 pillars of Attack the Network that Marines are able to comprehensively engage all 3 networks and accomplish the mission in the complex environments they will face in the future.
Why should you care about Attack the Network? Because we learned a lot over the past 10 years, some at pretty bitter cost. It'd be a terrible waste to lose those lessons. We need to capture and institutionalize these lessons learned so we don't relearn all the same best practices in the next war. It took years of operating in an ID environment to get proactive instead of reactive. We cannot afford to do that again. Attack the Network is bigger than just counter ID, but it's still very relevant and applicable to that fight. Those who wish us ill have seen that IEDs are effective, and I guarantee you we're going to see them again. The 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah serves as an example of what happens when a conventional force does not properly prepare for a hybrid threat and attacks into a network it has not taken the time to understand. Taking advantage of the lessons learned over the past 10 years is up to you. We can learn from what others have done, or we can figure it out all over again by filling body bags. Semper Fi and good hunting, Marines.